Recently, I read 110 books. This video, I tell you which 10 of those are my favourites and which 5 of those are my worst. How I chose my favourites, I thought it'd be easy. I thought it'd just come down to me putting in my higher star ratings. But when it came down to it, actually, some of my favourites were a bit lower on the rankings. So what I did was I tallied up all the books I read, put in all the star ratings, chose from the higher end of the scale for obviously my favourites and obviously the lower end of the scale from the worst ones. So I picked some of the ones that weren't necessarily right at the top of my ratings, but actually have a higher place in my heart, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so starting at number 10 and working up, number 10 is the Natural series. Now, I know a series, should that really count? But to be fair, I did rate it as a 5-star series. If you don't know what the Natural series is about, it's about Cassie, who's the main female protagonist. She gets headhunted one day into an FBI program of people who have natural abilities. Cassie's natural ability is she's a great profiler. She can tell a lot about a person just by looking at them, looking at little actions they do. Say, for example, if they've got a bit of a tic or they fidget a lot, how their character relates to their demeanour. The intention of the FBI program with the people with the natural abilities is to try and solve cold cases. So basically cases that haven't been solved at the time. Other examples of people in the FBI program are Sloane, who is great with maths and statistics, and Leah, who is a natural lie detector. She can tell when people are lying, basically, but also she is a great liar herself. Whilst the aim is for the naturals to help solve the cold cases, like I mentioned, they actually get drawn into current cases due to the situations going on around them as well. Cassie also has a personal reason why she wants to join. She's got a personal cold case that she actually wants to find out further information on. Now, as we're talking about the series itself, you should know that each book obviously has its own plot line, but there is an overarching story. So what is the reason that I put the Natural series in my top 10? For a start, the writing is brilliant within the series. The pacing is really fast, the plots are really interesting, and the characters themselves are fascinating with their natural abilities. I really like the fact that they also use those abilities to try and solve cold cases and then are obviously drawn into current cases. There are definitely twists that I did not see come in, and I think that's really important within this type of genre of book, because obviously if you can guess the plot line, then it's a bit boring, really. I read this series whilst I was on holiday for a week, and I absolutely flew through the series, so much so that I stayed up late reading into the night when I should have been sleeping, and I love my sleep. Overall, The Naturals is a great young adult thrilling mystery series. If you want a more in-depth review, then I will put a video card up here for my video, The Natural series. Is it really worth the hype? Spoiler alert! It's in my top 10 for a reason. So number 9 on my list is Expiration Dates by Rebecca Searle. Now, Expiration Dates is actually one of the books that officially wouldn't have been on my top 10 list if it was down to literal just the star ratings. However, it's still got a 4.5, I'd like to point out, so it's still, you know, a really high rating. But this book was one of the ones that is in my heart, and I still think about it to this day, so it had to be in my top 10 list. Okay, so the premise of the book is Daphne, for every romantic relationship that she has, she receives from the universe, I guess, a note to say who the person is and how long the romantic relationship is going to last, and I loved that premise for the book, and that is why I bought the book. And once I'd actually received the book, it was kind of like a beacon to me, and it was just like, read me, read me, read me. So I read it pretty quickly as soon as I received it. I absolutely flew through this book. I read it within 24 hours. The writing is brilliant. I loved Daphne as a character, and obviously I found the premise of the book just so interesting to me in regards to receiving expiration dates for her romantic relationships. I am an absolute sucker for a kind of dating book, so this definitely ticks quite a lot of my boxes. The funny thing about this book is, once I had finished reading it, I'd kind of forgotten and I was really looking forward to reading it, and then I was sad because I realised I'd finished the book. So if that doesn't tell you how I feel about the book, I don't know what else does. So number 8 on my favourite list is Just Like Magic by Sarah Hogle. This book is based on Betty Hughes. She's the main female protagonist, and she comes from a famous, very rich family. Problem is, Betty is really struggling. She doesn't have any money. She's pretending she does. She doesn't want to lose face, essentially. But it's coming up to Christmas time and she's planning to go back for the holidays to see her family, and she's dreading it a bit because she's not sure she can keep the pretense up. One day before the Christmas holiday starts, she gets a little bit tipsy and she manages to trip over a record player whilst the record player is playing All I Want for Christmas, so it plays it backwards. And that is where Hall comes in. Hall is the holiday spirit, but in human form, essentially. The funny thing about this book is Betty isn't really a very likeable character, but in a great way, because I'm definitely more of the type of person who likes to read about nice characters. Betty, you can't really say is a very nice character, but when she's teamed up with Hall, who is basically the complete opposite of her, such a lovely guy, a very happy chappy, golden retriever type, like you get in books, it just works. So Hall's mission as the holiday spirit is to cheer Betty up. He needs to kind of get her into the holiday spirit. Once he's done so, he will go on to the next person who needs cheering up for the holidays. Part of what Hall can do is grant wishes that have limited abilities. You know, you can't just wish for anything. But Betty does definitely use it to her advantage, and that is what is really hilarious in this book. So this book definitely has the Christmassy vibes. It gives you kind of a warm, fuzzy feeling inside. It's obviously one of my top Christmas books of the year, as well as one of my top books of the year. If you want a more in-depth review, then you can obviously watch my 17 books I read for Christmas up here. So the next book, number 7, is Grace After Henry by Ethan Shortall. I hope that's pronounced right. I'm not sure how you say it. I apologise. Grace has just lost her boyfriend, Henry, hence the title of the book. And then it's kind of the aftermath of that and how she struggles to cope after his death. So obviously trigger warnings of death and grief. I would say it is told very well though. His death is told very subtly and gently. So that is one aspect of the book. Also, as Grace goes out and about in her life, she seems to think that she sees Henry everywhere, like I'm sure happens in most cases when you have lost someone you love. One day her boiler breaks down and the person who comes to fix it is an exact carbon copy of her boyfriend Henry, pretty much. So obviously part of the story is, why does this person look so exactly like her ex-boyfriend Henry? The reason this book is on my favourites list is because of how well the writing tells how Grace is dealing with the aftermath of losing Henry. I would definitely be looking out other books by this author. The next book I read on Libby, actually, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. The book is set initially around 300 years ago. Addie has been promised to be married to one of their neighbours and his kids in kind of an arranged marriage, which she desperately does not want to happen. She doesn't want any ties or any obligations. She wants to be able to go and do what she wants. She wants to be able to go travel, see new places. She doesn't want to get married and basically have her life decided for her. As a last minute resort, she makes a deal with the devil. as you can imagine, things aren't quite so straightforward when you make a deal with the devil. Addie is not remembered by anyone. No one in her life, so her family do not remember her. But that's just a start. For example, she can pay for a room for a B&B, but as soon as Addie walks away, the person has forgotten that she has paid for a room. So she can't stay there. And it actually brings up a lot of questions, and that is one of the reasons why this is in my favourites book, because it made me realise there are a lot of things that you wouldn't think about that you wouldn't be able to do if you couldn't be remembered from one minute to the next. It also tests her morals because, for example, she has no money. What does she do to make money when no one can remember? She can't get a job, and so on. There were a lot of instances like that I really liked in the book. I enjoyed reading this book so much, a couple of days ago it actually came up on Kindle as 99p, and I'd originally read it on Libby, the library lending app, so I actually bought it because I do think I will probably read it again at some point. So there you go. So number 5 on my favourites list is The Christmas Wish by Lindsay Kelk. Gwen is newly single. She goes back to her family home for the Christmas holidays, and while she's there she meets someone she used to know back in the day. They used to be quite friendly before they went to university, I think it was, and that is Dev. She keeps waking up on Christmas Day. Every single day she wakes up is Christmas Day, so it's kind of like a groundhog time travel-y book. So obviously when each day resets, everyone forgets what's happened the previous day because it's Christmas Day over and over again. So Gwen has to try and work out how to get on to the next day, how to get to Boxing Day. That is basically the premise of the book. There are loads of things that I liked about the book, but the main thing for me was the author's humour that comes across in the writing in the book. That is what made this book for me. Also, one of the main things that I liked about the book was the possible romance, and it was a romance that I could really get behind as well. This book definitely has the Christmassy vibes and is one of my favourite Christmas books that I read at the end of last year. So number 4 on my favourites list is Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmis. Elizabeth Zott is a chemist working at the Hastings Research Institute. Now obviously this is set in the 60s, so women weren't exactly treated as equally as we are nowadays. Elizabeth Zott is such an interesting character. She's straight to the point, she's a strong female in times where it's not as easy to be a woman. She meets Calvin Evans, who is a male famous scientist, and her world changes. Fun fact, but when I was making notes for this book, I kept calling him Calvin Harris. That would have been a completely different story if he had been written in the book. Then the book fast forwards a couple of years and she's offered a job on a television show as a chef. Lessons in Chemistry is such a wonderful book, especially I would say if you're a woman reading it. The standout of this book to me are the characters, particularly Elizabeth Zott, like I've already mentioned, and honourable mention to her dog, who is called 6:30, like the time. I absolutely loved the romance in this book. The writing is great in this book, especially the humour, but also, spoiler alert, I did shed a tear or two reading it. So number 3 in my favourite books is Sunset by Jessie Cave. Ruth and Hannah are sisters, and they're basically polar opposites. Ruth is a bit aimless and a bit of a wild child. Hannah is the hard-working sister who is very organised. But every year they go on holiday together. This year, however, something bad happens. Now, in general, I tend to steer clear of celebrities who write books. Jessie is a comedian and she has been on panel shows, amongst other things. Obviously, she's a writer as well. But yeah, I tend to steer clear of celebrity books because in general I do find they're not very good. However, this one completely blew my assumptions away. It's quite funny because if you describe this book to me with some of the things that happen within the book, I would say that's probably not the book for me, but something about it just works. Now, there are trigger warnings for death and grief, and I listened to it on audio, and whilst I was listening to it, I had to stop because I was bawling my eyes out and I was actually meant to be going out, so I had to stop listening to it. Also, if you are listening to the book on audio, on the version I had, there is a little bit of an interview with the author and her sister. Her sister reads the book, and her sister nails it, by the way, reading the book. But it is a mini interview with Jessie and how she came about with the idea of this book, and that's quite emotional too. So the main reasons I put this book on my favourites list is it has so much heart to it. I felt so emotional reading it. The writing is excellent. The characters feel like real characters, and it was just a really amazing book to read. I really recommend you read it. So book number 2 is The Boyfriend by Frida McFadden. I know that Frida's books tend to be Marmite with people. You either love them or you hate them, but this book, I definitely loved it. So this book is based on Sydney, who is the main female protagonist. She has got to the point in her life where she's looking for a romantic partner, a boyfriend, etc. So she goes on to this website app to try and meet new people. One of the dates that she goes on doesn't go very well, basically, and he sort of assaults her. This other man steps in and helps her, and those two, Sydney and this man, start dating. In the meantime, the police are actually tracking a man who appears to be dating ladies and then killing them. So there are past and present timelines with Sydney and another person, and you are constantly wondering, are they going to intertwine at one point? And that is one of the things that I really enjoyed about this book. I was genuinely thrilled to read this book, and I did not see all the twists coming, and I didn't actually want it to end. So my number 1 book for the books that I read last year is Matt Haig's The Life Impossible. Grace finds out she's inherited from an old acquaintance a small house in Ibiza. Now, Grace has recently lost her husband, so feels like perhaps it would be a good time to get away. Nothing's holding her back, so she might as well go away on a holiday. Now, there are definite trigger warnings for this book of death and grief, and how heavy grief can weigh on you. But it's not all a sad book. It is actually quite a life-affirming book, and there is also a supernatural stroke magical element to the book, just in case you like or dislike that. I originally didn't actually rate this book a 5 stars, surprisingly, but I have thought about this book so much in the past few months after reading it that I have to bump it up. This book spoke to me and made me so emotional reading it, and I still get emotional to talk about it now, so it actually says a lot. This is definitely my favourite book of the year, and from all the books that I've read of Matt Haig so far, it's definitely my favourite book of his as well. So that sums up my favourite top 10 books of the year. So now, let's get on to my 5... I've got a visitor. So that sums up my 10 favourite books of the year that I read last year. Now let's get on to my least favourite of the year. Do you know what they are? So number 5 on my least favourite books of the year, Go Set a Watchman by Harper Lee. I read this book in my video. I finally read the classic books To Kill a Mockingbird and Go Set a Watchman. So if you want to read the full in-depth review, I'll leave a video card here. The female protagonist of this book is Scout Finch. You will obviously know that if you've read To Kill a Mockingbird, but this is her when she's a bit older, when she's 26. She has been working in New York and she comes back to Macomb, Alabama, where Atticus Finch, her father, resides. He's struggling a little bit and she's come back to help him, essentially. She also has a bit of a romance with her childhood sweetheart, Hank. The reason I chose to put this on my list for my 5 worst books is because I didn't feel like there was actually much of a story, and I do feel like perhaps it detracted from the original book, which obviously isn't a good thing. I found Scout to be very judgmental and unrealistic in her opinions, and she has a lot of opinions. Now, I do know that some people who read the book felt like Atticus had become racist within this book. I don't quite feel the same way. I feel like Atticus was trying to point out that society isn't always what you want it to be. That's the way I read it anyway. Please note the book is heavily centred on racism and society's influences and pressures at the time. This is around the 1950s. Overall, I found this book pretty boring, to be honest, and I didn't feel like there was a need for a follow-up like this from To Kill a Mockingbird. So number 4 is The Cast by Danielle Steele. Kate Whittier has a beloved magazine column that she's, quite famous for. She then writes a novel based on her grandmother's experiences in the war. After a chance meeting with a television producer, he would like to make it into a TV series, and he offers her like the writer consultant for the TV series. And that's pretty much the book. There's a little bit of drama within the making of the TV show, but nothing too interesting. And the most shocking part of the book that they could have really delved into was actually glossed over, and it was kind of like irrelevant that it happened. Also within the book, I found like there was a lot of characters' names that were not relevant to the book or the story, that were just kind of thrown out there, and they just didn't seem necessary. I didn't actually choose this book myself. I was actually bought this book, and this isn't the type of book that I would normally read just for context. All in all, I actually just found the book rather bland. So number 3 is Toxic by Jackie Rose. This is another book that I didn't buy for myself, just so you know. Bree is the wife of a Cockney gangster, basically, and she is trying to escape him. There is a lot of other Cockney gangsters and turf wars, not particularly pleasant scenes within the book, so obviously warnings for that if you don't like stuff like that. I found the book very silly. I didn't like the writing style. I found it very contrived, not very realistic. Just so you're aware, obviously this isn't the type of book I would normally pick up either. So I won't pick up another book like this again. It's just not for me. Number 2 is The Upside of Falling Down by Rebecca Crane. Clementine Haas is the sole survivor of a plane crash. She wakes up in an Irish hospital and decides she doesn't want to go back to her life just yet. So she befriends Kieran, who is visiting the hospital, I think, and asks if she can stay with him for a couple of weeks and then she'll move on. I had a few issues with this book. One of the main things that bothered me is there is a male nurse within the hospital. The first thing he does is looks at her, brings her a bra that is exactly her size. The next part, the male nurse offers Clementine some books that she can read while she's in the hospital. She chooses one. The male nurse deduces from her choice that she's definitely not gay because the book she chose has, a half-naked man on it. I found those interactions were just so icky to me, and the fact that Clementine didn't find him repulsive when I, as a reader, did, it didn't gel with me at all. The rest of the book is pretty boring, and I didn't really like the writing, if I'm perfectly honest, and it has put me off reading any more of Rebecca's books in the future. I'm not saying I won't ever read them again, but when you really dislike a book, it does put you off books by the same author. Also, there wasn't a real explanation as to why Clementine didn't want to go back to her real life that I can remember. And also, Kieran didn't question why she didn't want to go back to her real life. It just didn't make sense. I also think part of the reason that I didn't like this book was it was such a great concept of being the sole survivor of a plane crash, and then the rest of the book just didn't live up to it. It was just so boring in comparison. And now, the worst book I read of last year is The Highly Sensitive Person by Elaine Aron. So I picked the book up because I read the back of the book and I thought, okay, well perhaps I do have some aspects to my personality. You could say I'm a highly sensitive person. I actually don't have much to say about the book. I found it was a lot of case studies of people. It was very boring. I don't feel like the book was helpful or interesting. I listened to the book on audio and honestly it felt like every other word was arousal. And I know obviously it means in a physiological sense, but it just grossed me out a bit, I'll be perfectly honest. I genuinely just can't think of anything positive to say about the book. If a self-help book doesn't help you and you don't find it interesting and it bores you, it's not really doing its job. So that's the wrap up of my 10 favourite books that I read last year and my 5 least favourite books of last year. Do you agree or disagree with any of the books that are on my list? Are there any surprises in there? I would love to hear your thoughts and what perhaps your favourite books were last year or your least favourite books. As always, if you like book reviews, please stick around, subscribe to the channel because I plan to do a lot more. Thanks everybody, goodbye.